Welcome, and I am so excited to be here today. I'm Rachel O'Mara. I am the moderator today for a panelist Q&A with Changing Work's latest book that we are all excited to get our hands onto, Leading with Compassion. I have two of the authors here today. We'll introduce them and then they'll share their intro as well. We've got Rachel Radway and Lorna Hagen. Rachel, hi, great to see you today. Would you like to share a little bit about yourself and background?
Hi, Rachel. Yes, I
Hello,
would
Rachel.
love to. So, I am an executive and leadership coach who works with women leaders with fast, busy minds, people who tend to identify as being wired a little bit differently, and that can mean a lot of different things. I'm also a speaker and an author, and before I started my coaching business, I worked in the corporate world for about 25 plus years, which is one of the reasons I'm so passionate about what changing work is doing. Because we need a lot more psychological safety and compassion and inclusion in our workplaces today.
Awesome, thank you. And Lorna, hello as well. Welcome, welcome. Can you share a little bit about
Rachel.
yourself? Hi.
Yeah, sure. I am the co-founder of a small boutique consulting firm called Win Consulting. And we work with executive teams and chief executives to really help them accelerate performance. And we do it through employee productivity. Before that, I was a several-time chief people officer at companies big and public, as well as small and venture-backed. And I'm also an executive coach, more specifically for chief people officers and up and coming leaders in the HR space. And I'm a single mom of three, so that has been really keeping me very busy, but about to empty nest. So very excited about
Awesome.
that.
Yes, awesome. And we'll get into it. I know both of you share some of your story in your respective chapters. So again, just for everyone listening, the book title is Leading with Compassion, Cultivating Connection from the Inside Out. And Rachel, your chapter is chapter 6, The World We All Design. Lorna, your chapter is 24, The Fall and Rise of General Lorna. I cannot wait to get into both of these. And I know I didn't introduce myself too much, but I'm a volunteer here. I've been with Changing Work for almost a year, and I am a professional leadership coach for executives, and I'm also a co-founder of a venture studio working with life sciences where I coach the founders. So very, very excited to be in here. I know I was part of the first book. These books, I should add, are a collaboration of 25 authors. So we only have a small taste today of two of these stories. But let's just dive in. And Rachel, let's start with you. I think what I would love to know is just tell us a little bit about compassion. You were called to write your chapter here. What does compassion mean to you, and why did you choose to write about what you wrote about in chapter 6?
So it's interesting, Rachel. This was something, as soon as I heard the title of the book that Changing Work was going to be putting out, I knew that I wanted to be involved. Um, I have always been very empathic. So I can easily put myself into someone else's shoes. I get other people's feelings. Compassion is a little bit different, and this is one of the fascinating things about the book is 25 different authors' understandings of what compassion means and what it means to them. I have in the past few years I have felt that compassion is something that was a lot harder for me, especially in earlier years, than empathy was. And one of the things that I see in almost all of my clients and in all of my mastermind members is a challenge with self-compassion in particular. They're all highly empathetic people and very caring. And a lot of them are super compassionate as well, and not always able to give that to themselves, to be compassionate to themselves. So that was part of what I wanted to explore when I was writing my chapter. And um, what changed, and kind of where I was coming from, and why I felt that compassion wasn't something that came easily to me.
I'm hearing it was a like a call, like a resonant calling for you because it was near and dear to your heart that it was, and you say this in the book, it's innate and learned.
Exactly. Exactly. And I think it's a muscle that we can learn to flex more and get more used to. And there are also, as I say in my chapter, there are things that can block it. And I think that's a lot of what was going on in my childhood.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, thank you. And how about for you, Lorna? Can you share why this topic was so important for you to write about and maybe a little taste of what your chapters are all about?
Yeah, for me, there are a lot of similarities with what Rachel said. I found myself really fighting against that um, kind of generalized reputation of HR as the touchy-feely people and department. And I think subconsciously I went into a very data-driven, performance-driven mode and kind of grew my career that way and was successful, even though there had been these very rarely, but I do remember one specific employee saying to me, "You're the least HRE person I know." And I always thought about that, thinking, well, what does he mean by that? And I think it was about compassion. And it was we were having a difficult conversation, and he needed a level of hand holding that I still don't believe my role should have given him, but in the middle there was an answer, right? So he needed something that I wasn't willing to give, but I should have been willing to give something to him in that situation. And so that was a theme that came up a few times, and I was thinking about this, especially after COVID, and thinking about, well, what do the employees of my organization need? Is that different than what I'm giving and should be giving the executives? And oh, by the way, like, what about my real primary team, which is my family? And so in putting those three pieces together, that really made me want to take a deeper look and write about kind of the evolution that I had gone through, and how I finally got to a different place of balance between the two hats that I needed to wear in my role and as a mom.
Yeah, and I know from your story when I was reading it, I definitely experienced that flip. I relate a lot in my world where I had a similar situation where work was all about the work world and being fully on, and then not even thinking about the home front and my relationship crumbling in front of me and things like that. So I just really got that story in the general as well. So thank you. And for Rachel, how about you? Can you share a little bit? I know you have you have a trail of adversities that you start out with, and talk a lot about your history. And I also really enjoyed the way you started your chapter too. I was riveted from the get-go.
Rachel, I'm so glad to hear that because I really worried about that. It's funny, when we had our first meeting about the book and we're talking about the definition of compassion, and we're starting to think about stories that came up for us. Those workshops that I described at the beginning were the first things that came to mind. And as I wrote the chapter, I remember thinking, and I still think it when I read it over now. As we're recording this, the book isn't out yet. And I really didn't know how people were going to react to that because it's a very different experience um, than the way that a lot of the chapters start, even though they're all very different. They all start with a very personal thing, and mine takes a slightly different approach. So, sorry,
Yeah,
Rachel,
well, I don't
on
want
your
to spoil it
question.
for anyone who I know they want to read the book, but I'll just share the high level of it where m- my thought is, we don't often think about the most important things in our life and really put that literally to pen to paper. So, having a list of the things that you would least likely want to lose in
Hmm.
your life, to me, is very daunting. That's a very confronting task.
Yeah.
And that's, a little bit about your story. And so for you, you talk about these adversities that you had growing up and being in New York, and there were bullies, there were these things, and then you discovered what I would say is an area of your strengths, these adversities and things that maybe weren't a strength at the time that you thought of. I'd love you to share a little bit about how does that, how does that tie into putting yourself in someone else's shoes, and how, like, because I think a lot of leaders go through something like that where there's just like you feel like you're going uphill all the time. In your case, this was like a younger version of you, but
Mhm.
how can someone learn from that or know more about what they could do differently in service to compassion? That is the muscle that's hard to strengthen sometimes.
Absolutely. I think, we all, what comes to mind, several things are coming to mind. One of them is the meta meditation. I don't know if you both are familiar with it, but likely the meditation on compassion, where you go through this exercise where you wish for some things for yourself and then you start wishing them for other people. And what is so easy to forget as we're all going through our daily lives and taking care of all of the crises and the daily drama and all of the things that come up, whether we're in a leadership role or not, is everyone out there is dealing with something, right? Before we started recording, I shared a couple of the things that are going on in my, where I'm living today, which was a little bit of drama I wasn't expecting. Um, Everyone is going through something a lot of the time, if not all the time. And while some of us are really strong in empathy and we can kind of understand what someone is going through, that's usually when they bring it up. It's not something we don't have our spidey senses on all the time. That can be really tough, right? Just making the effort to remember to stop and think that everyone is dealing with hardships and that everyone wants the same things. We all want connection and a feeling of safety and security. And, we could talk about Maslow's hierarchy. So a lot of people describe compassion as empathy in action. It's going that step further to really want to help. Once we can pause and, put our own stuff on hold and look at the other person and realize, you know what? They've probably got a lot of things going on that I'm not aware of, because I know I have a lot of things going on that they're not aware of. That's true of everyone in our life.
Mhm.
An easy way to think about how to put compassion into action is to just stop and think about that. You can do it when you're frustrated. You can do it when you're about to go into a meeting. You can do it when you're, having a difficult conversation, or you can just flex that muscle and do it regularly. Take a moment to pause every time you have an interaction, whether it's going to be a difficult one or not. Um, Lorna says something in her chapter about, every leadership role requires a different approach. Every situation we're in requires a different approach because we're in it with someone different who has different needs. And the same way we have different needs depending on what's going on, if we can just keep that in mind, it can help bring more compassion into all of our workplaces and our home lives and everywhere in between.
Powerful. Very, very great point in that empathy in action is compassion, and that if we just stop or pause, love that word, by the way, the word book on it, there's an idea of having this opportunity for thinking about the other person in a way you may not otherwise had. And that's really, really important, I think, in leadership. And Lorna, in your world, I'd love you to talk a little bit about your title, because I think it's gripping the rise and fall of General Lorna. Can you share a little bit about how that relates to this topic, and where's General Lorna now?
Um, I really struggled with that title, but we went with it. So you know what, I want to follow through on what Rachel just said about this idea of really understanding that everyone's going through something, and I'll give you a little bit of context here, which is that, I have been a single mom for 12 years, 13 years, and my kids are um 20 and 17, two 17-year-olds and a 20-year-old. So I've been doing this on my own for a very long time. Meaning I'm single parenting children who are not empathetic and compassionate, right? Little kids, that is just not a muscle that they have developed. And so a lot of my time, right, when I wasn't at work, all of my time was spent mothering children who don't really care if you're having a good or a bad day, but don't even understand if you're having a good or bad. They just want to play. They want to be fed. They want to be put to bed. They want to be read a story. And the general thing came from this idea of I can't control what's happening. It has to be dictatorial. I am the general. You are the soldiers. This is when we eat. This is when we get dressed. This is when you walk to school. This is when you get picked up. And it's got to work that way. If not, everything falls off the rails, i.e., my career. And so let's operate. This is our operating system at home so that I can then go and be more compassionate at work. And it wasn't until I went to a retreat that somebody asked me, we were in a group of people and the facilitator in this group was asking about mindset, and we were talking about the Carol Dweck book, and he said, what's a mindset of yours that you have? And I wrote, oh my God, I am the general, you are the soldiers, on a piece of paper. And he said, close your eyes. And we all closed our eyes. And he said, does that serve you? And I just started to cry, because I think what happened was somehow the general at work started to go into the general at home started to go into the general at work. And it was COVID. So while kind of instinctually, I'm like, no, that's the mentality that you needed to have for COVID. It was not, right? And so I ended up leaving that job, and it was all really very hard at home and at work. And I thought that mindset doesn't serve me at all. How do you start to evolve now? And how do you take this moment in time, 2020, 21, even into 22, and think about leadership and parenthood, which are combined in a much different way? And what I found was once I started thinking about it differently, then self-compassion almost like trickled down. It was like trickle down compassion, right? When my mindset shifted into how I'm treating other people, then my actions shifted in how I treated myself. And then it became kind of a virtuous cycle.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing this story and how it sounds like the general evolved and became more self-compassionate.
100%. And then what I found was with my kids, I've always been very direct. And I came home and I said, this is what has happened. And let's co-create how we want to coexist in this, reality now. And they thought I was nuts, but then eventually they got it and they're like, oh, so we can have an opinion. I'm
Well,
like, yes, you can.
yeah.
I'm not always going to say yes, but we're going to do things a little bit differently. And the same thing happened at work. I found it much easier, frankly, to be compassionate at work than with my kids. But I started to see just a different my reactions became different to my team and my colleagues, and then in kind. So yeah, I saw the whole thing shift really very clearly.
You have a powerful example, I think, for not just the parents out there who probably have potentially relating stories, or we have one way in a mode that we're at work, which is very productive and transactional, and yet, you being in HR was your forefront to be on that compassion side, but then if we forgot at home on the home front or vice versa.
Yeah.
And so it's like, how do I meld those into one person? And I want to share a quote I loved from your chapter, which I think is kind of ties it all up, and to me really is powerful in what you're sharing. It's about that compassion isn't about getting soft or lowering standards. It's actually quite different. And it's about recognizing the humanity in ourselves and others and about creating environments where people can thrive and not just survive. Very, very powerful. Because I do think when we think of compassion, our minds might wander into judgments around it being like, oh, my standards are lower. I'm just going to be kind to everyone and let people get away with things, or et cetera. And what I'm hearing is not at all. Like that is not what compassion is.
No, no. One of the things that I heard, this is definitely not mine, but I think attaches into what I wrote and how I was feeling is, clear is kind. And I
Mm.
was doing that relatively well with my team and my colleagues. I was doing it less well with my kids. And so, it's so easy for us to be in these jobs and read the Cynic Cynic book, start with the why, and so you operate that way in the workplace, and you come home and it's like, why? Well, because I said so. Like, just eat your dinner, do this, do that, go to bed, like all of the things. And the why just kind of disappears because you're just caught up in all the little things that ultimately don't matter.
Yeah. Yeah. And I want to segue to Rachel here because I think there's also a way that you are more kind to yourself when you're discovering some of these new ways you're wired. And in what ways were you learning this yourself in your story and in this leadership part that you're sharing?
So it it goes back to what I was saying before, that we're all different and we all have needs, and we forget that. Um, when I started working with leaders who are wired a little differently, and that can mean anything from people who have very high sensory sensitivities to people with ADHD to autistic people to other forms of neurodivergence. Um,
Mhm.
there are some traits that are very, very common to this population in general that include being harder on ourselves. We tend to have very, very high expectations for ourselves and for others, but especially for ourselves. We tend to be very detail oriented. We tend toward perfectionism. We tend toward um, a very rigid sort of moral compass, and wanting things to be a certain way and really not having a lot of allowance for them to be not that way. And I realize, I'm thinking about all of the different kinds of leadership roles that we all have at different points in our life around, to what Lorna's been talking about. Um, I think about new leaders, and I know that certainly when I was a new leader, and sometimes even when we are in a position that's similar to roles we've been in before, but when it's a new company or a new team or a new context, there is often a need to, first of all, to prove ourselves, to show that they made the right decision in bringing us, on board. Um, and for those of us who lean towards perfectionism and are very focused on details, there is a need to control. And so even if we've been, we've read Simon Sinek, and we've read all the things and done all the things, and we are typically more compassionate in our roles, there's an opportunity to sort of revert back to, oh my God, I'm in a new place. I need to prove myself again. I need to control everything. I know, looking back at some of my leadership roles before, I know I've done that. And I've always wished that I had handled things a little differently. Um, Once again, I think I'm going a little bit off from where your question was, Rachel.
That's okay. I love your riffing because what I'm hearing is we learn as we go, and when we're kind to ourselves, we can kind of like we can get really in our heads, I think is what I'm hearing. Like, yeah,
Yeah,
we want to we all want to succeed, we all want to be successful. So we read the books, we do the things, but the reality is if we're not practicing it on ourselves first and foremost, right? Being compassionate and kind to
exactly.
ourselves, then I think
Exactly.
that is a challenge, right? And I want to share a little passage that I thought really resonated. I've already quoted it a little bit myself, but the part that I love, Rachel, from your chapter is this moment of saying that compassion is both innate and learned. It can also be blocked by trauma, our environment, and other factors. And like any other emotional muscle, we can exercise it and practice until it becomes natural. That to me is an essence of what we're all talking about here today.
Yeah. It's one of the reasons that I love the title of the book itself, because of the different layers of meaning in leading with compassion. You know, part of it is, yes, in a leadership role, how do you espouse compassion? How do you encompass it and embrace it and lead with it? And the other piece of it is, as human beings, how do we start with compassion first? How do we go there instead of responding in another way to a situation that might be difficult or create fear or create, frustration or anger? How do we start with a more compassionate response? And to do that, it's a muscle we have to flex over and over again, and we have to be able to give it to ourselves before we can give it to other people.
Yeah. And that's the hard part, I think. Like you're saying, even you shared your inner critic got a little quieter when you started feeling that more kindness and compassion for yourself, which I think is such a big theme for so many of us. We all have our inner critics. And then, wow, what if I was actually sweet and gentle with this part of me that I'm not so that I'm a little abrasive with now or forgot about, and things can radically shift and change. So to me, that's a huge win for this
Oh
part
yeah.
of that. Awesome. All right. So we've talked about your books a little bit. We've talked about some of the reasons and motivation for writing it. I want to hear what the writing process was like for you. Do either of you want to just share about what that was like? How did it go? Anything you want to share that was particularly like an aha for you, or maybe surprised you about the process?
I'm happy to jump in.
Yeah, go for it.
I So this was really interesting timing for me because I am in the process of publishing a solo book
I
also.
know you're busy.
And so it's been busy, and I've been, I've been writing about things that are very, deeply held, and things that I haven't talked to a lot of people about, and things that I'm a little bit nervous about revealing. So it's definitely the vulnerability um, is huge when you're doing a project like this. One of the things that was interesting to me was that I felt even more vulnerable writing this chapter than I did writing my book. And that isn't necessarily an intuitive, a logical thing or an intuitive thing. Um, but in the chapter, I went into things about my childhood and my past that I really have not talked with anybody about in decades, and that a lot of my friends know nothing about. And it was the writing went very quickly, but I questioned myself more than I ever do with other kinds of writing projects that I'm working on, and even with my book. So it was really interesting um, in that way.
Mm. Thank you for sharing and love that insight. And being vulnerable is huge as a part of compassion, right? That's what we think. How about you for you, Lorna?
So similar. Honestly, my first reaction was, oh my God, how cool. Yes, I'm in on this project. And then when I sat down and wrote a draft and I thought it was garbage, I threw it out. I wrote a different one, threw it out. And finally I was like, I think it's got to be more personal for it to matter. Um, it was really scary. And there were just things, listen, I'm literally calling out myself as a parent. Like there is no worse Hunger Games sport, at least in New York City, than competing to see who's a better parent. So that was really scary. And obviously things just about my work as well. Um, and very much like Rachel, I was like, oof, do I want to put this out there? And I thought it was important. Um, listen, the big aha learning I think people will take out of it is the parenting thing, but honestly that impacts everything. And I think that people will see it now, and I hope they say, well, gee, I'd love to work for her, or I'd like to learn from this. But it didn't come without a lot of second guessing, um, allowing that vulnerability to be okay in public. I think, in reading Rachel's chapter and comparing it to mine, we both, for different reasons, I always say, you live in New York City long enough, you start developing a plexiglass, a real thick plexiglass in front of you. Nobody sees it, but it says, step away. Right. And so I think you'll see a little bit of that in both of these chapters. And the publishing of it, frankly, starts to crack that a little bit. And that's vulnerable and scary.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for sharing. And I want to acknowledge both of you, and along with every other author in this book, is the vulnerability that it does take to share. Because like you said, it's if it's not about myself, then it's just not going to resonate as much. I know as an author, that's the hardest part. And it can be a surprise, but it works. And so credit to both of you for sharing vulnerably your story and saying yes to helping everyone up level from when it comes to compassion in any way, shape, or form that serves them. Is there anything else either of you want to add to your chapters? I know we talked a little bit about each other's chapters and what resonated. Rachel, maybe there's anything else you want to share about Lorna's chapter?
Oh, I really enjoyed it. It's funny, I didn't even think about the New York City thing, but that's true. That
We're
is.
both New Yorkers. I was there 10 years as well. I relate to the plexiglass and step away. We're not used to being vulnerable whatsoever, I think.
Yeah, and it's interesting that that was formative for me because I lived in New York City from the ages of 8 to 18. So those were the years that formed that plexiglass shield. Might have been thicker than plexiglass, I'm not sure.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah. How
I
about
think,
you, Lorna?
for me, I feel like there's so much, right? Like after I wrote this chapter, I thought, oh my God, I need to just like do a whole, I want to do some sort of like master class on how do you really think about leadership and compassion. But ultimately what I hope, and I mentioned this a little bit before we got on the call, is I really hope my kids read this, right? One is they are city kids, right? Born and raised. And the other is there is a way to be in the world where you're not alone. And I think ultimately that's what I learned, right? There are people that are rooting for you all the time, even when you feel that's not the case. And when you finally realize that and let your guard down, like so many great things can come from that.
Hmm.
I love that. Yeah.
I love that too. Were you going to say something, Rachel?
No, I just that was
We all
beautifully.
love it. And yes, so both of you, like I think the themes and the threads are learning to be compassionate with yourself and seeing how that ripples out to the world, and to step into your own vulnerability as way of courageous, as an act of courage, I'd say, that can just serve you so much more than you probably even imagine. And both of you have great stories for that. All
And
right.
I think, sorry, just what Lorna said, that we're all in it together, right? None of us are
We
alone.
are all in it
And that
together.
it is so important in the whole concept of compassion.
We're in it together, I think, is a great way to kind of wrap this all up, in that this book, changing from changingwork.org, and again, it's out. You can find it under the heading of media and Amazon on changingwork.org. I want to close with just where we can find you in the world. Rachel, where can we find you in the world? How can people find more out about you and your services? I know you help a lot of folks who are with their special neurodivergent needs as well.
Sure. You can find me in two places primarily. One is at rercoaching.com. It's my initials, RER, coaching.com. And the other place is on LinkedIn. Fortunately, there are not a lot of Rachel Radways in the world, and you should be able to find me pretty quickly. I think I'm the only executive and leadership coach on there named Rachel Radway. So
Awesome. How about you, Lorna?
Same for me. LinkedIn is always the best. I think I'll be the first Lorna Hagen that pops up, and then lornahagencoaching.com.
Awesome. Thank you. And again, the book is called Change Leading with Compassion, Creating Connection from the Inside Out, which is imperative for all leaders in this day and age. Chapter 6 is Rachel's chapter, The World We All Design. Chapter 24 is Lorna's chapter, The Fall and Rise of General Lorna. Ladies, I just want to thank you for your time today. Thank you so much for sharing more about what you have been working on here in this book. And again, kudos for your contributions. I cannot wait to get it out in the world.
Thanks, Rachel.